In this lesson, we're going to focus on keyword spotting data pre-processing, which is part of the data collection pipeline, but it's also useful when we are actually training models. So think of what happens, for instance, when you say, "Okay, Google." The first thing that happens is that you have your microphone, which is a sensor, which is picking up the audio signal, which is actually an analog signal, and converting that to the digital signal that can then actually be processed effectively for your neural network. So we'll be understanding the sequence that we're going to go through and what all the nuances you have to watch out for. So this is going to be very much at the beginning of the pipeline that we'll be walking through. We already talked about collecting the data and how to build a rich, good data set. Well, that's the sounds. But now, before you actually get around to training the model, you actually have to do pre-processing on that data, which we learn in this particular video, and then use that to actually train the network as we go forward. So let's step through and understand what exactly is going on when you're collecting an audio signal from a sensor like a microphone. All we hear really are just sound waves that are vibrating, and your microphone is effectively picking up those vibrations and converting them into an electrical signal, which is in the form of voltage distortions that you're going to have. And these are going to be sampled at a certain rate because you're effectively picking up those signals periodically and digitizing them. With the microphone, for instance, you will be seeing that you're picking up the audio signal at around 16 kilohertz, which means that 16,000 samples per second gets picked up continuously. And that data of 16,000 samples per second, and somehow it has to get fed into this neural network. So this leads to an interesting set of questions. So for the microphone, we have 16,000 kilohertz signal that's coming in, and we have 16,000 data points with each sample. So the first question is, do we need all that data? Something to think about, right? What level of sampling is actually good? Do we feed, all of that data into the network directly? Or can we try to extract some critical features? Can we actually be smarter than that, right? So that's where the creative thinking comes in. So we need to understand what aspects of the signal that we really want to pick up. So let's take the sample here of "no" said loudly. And what we are looking at is a time domain signal. X-axis is effectively just the time, and the y-axis is the amplitude of the signal. What's interesting here is that you have a wide signal, and the important part of the "no" is somewhere in the middle of the signal. Everything is a signal. So the question is, how do we first and foremost figure out where the "no" is? Where does it start? Somehow we actually have to identify the entire "no" that is pronounced here. The other thing that is that it's the same word "no." We said loudly versus "no," quietly. It doesn't matter whether it's said loudly or quietly, we still have to identify that crucial region. And yet, what we are seeing here is that just by looking at the raw waveforms that are coming in, we cannot tell the difference. The left hand and the right hand look completely different, even though it's the exact same word that's being said. If I show you this figure, do you know what the words are? Well, you couldn't possibly know. Well, but you can, can you tell us something interesting here? Well, the bottom two are effectively the "no" from the previous slide, and the top ones are "yes." And again, I'm trying to make some critical point here that the same word can look totally different in its raw format. This is why pre-processing a signal is actually extremely critical, because we want to extract the salient features, because the two "no's" and the two "yeses", there's some hidden information in there that clearly corresponds to yes and no. But looking at these raw waveforms, we just cannot tell the left-hand "no" from the right-hand "no" and the left-hand "yes" from the right-hand "yes". They're actually the same, right? So how do we go about distilling this, right? Some of the interesting challenges that we're going to get into are really that when you have this raw waveform that's coming out, you got to first and foremost figure out, where does the word really start? That's called alignment. So you've got to align or extract the critical part of the signal that actually corresponds, in order for us to figure out whether it's a yes or a no or any other word. We need to figure out, how to actually extract the aligned part of the signal and extract the critical features that are hidden in there. So let's step through those things next. Specifically, how can we differentiate the uniqueness in these signals? If we go back to and look at this figure, that 16 kilohertz analog signal is getting a digital representation, which we are looking at is in a kind of waveform that we've seen earlier. Now, what we want to do is to be able to pull out the interesting tidbits between these two variants. So if you look at any signal, right, it's fundamentally a composition of other primitive signals. So a signal on the right, for instance, that we're looking at has an interesting shape. It's really a composition of the instance of the signal that's on the top and the bottom on the left side. Now, we totally just drew this, but you get the idea, is that a complex signal can be deconstructed into a set of different signals that each have a critical frequency. So the frequency on the top and the frequency on the bottom one are completely different. And the resulting combination of those signals will also look different, which is what you have on the right-hand waveform. So what I'm hinting at is that if we look at a keyword like this, what does the decomposition look like? What are the frequencies, the fundamental frequencies that are all sitting inside that signal? If we can extract that, then perhaps regardless of how loud or how quiet it is, then we can actually get a sense of the same word. That's where Fourier transforms come in. Fourier transforms is a very simple process, right? That tries to extract a time domain signal into a frequency domain signal. So it does this conversion by trying to look at what are the frequencies that are present in that signal. That's the first step. Why do we do this? Because by extracting the critical frequencies, it's like trying to find a fingerprint effectively. It's one of the steps, but it's a crucial step. If you're not familiar with Fourier transforms and FFT, which stands for how you do fast Fourier transform, don't worry about it. I have a reading that will actually give you pointers and explains the exact process that's involved. Because if I have to teach FFT, we'll have to start this whole new course just about signal processing. No, but let's stay focused on the critical building block that corresponds to building a keyword spotting ML application here. So the first step is really extracting the frequencies which FFT allows us to do. Now, one of the key things you'll realize is that you say, hey, no, it's not a snapshot. It's actually a set of frequencies that are emitting over time. No. Right? Maybe it takes about half a second. I don't know. So something like that, right? Well, when I say yes, that's a set of frequencies that's changing over time, right? And this pattern that we want to extract, essentially capture, because a pattern is this unique fingerprint. And how do we do that over time, right? Well, this is where we have to do the FFT, which we are extracting those critical frequencies out. Well, and we have to also go and do that for the entire sound. So once we align or chop out the critical bit of the no in here, we start at its beginning, and we have that's called a sliding window, where we're doing the FFT to extract out the frequencies along the time domain. And in doing that, we look at something like this, where we are overlapping windows that are kind of sliding over the times. It's about 25 to 30 milliseconds. And that's the typical window size. The reading explains why it's about the size, that size. It's effectively a good measure for capturing the critical features and to be able to see the transience, that's happening over time and the frequency response to it for human speech. So as we kind of step through this, what we can do is we can generate an interesting plot that actually shows us something about what the frequencies are pronounced and how it's changing over time in their strength on the right-hand side, which is called a spectrogram. The spectrogram is effectively a visual representation of the signal and all the different frequencies that are involved and how it's changed over time. That's all there is, right? It's a beautiful picture. Now, if I go back and look at the original features that we are looking at, these audio signals, and I convert them into spectrograms, which is beautiful. And what you'll see is at the top of it looks quite distinct. Specifically, if you look at the top yes ones, and then you see that they have a distinctive signature that stands out from the ones that are below for the no's. The no's don't have any strong amplitude of visibility there. The strength of that color or the vibrancy of that color is telling us how strong those frequencies actually are pronounced, right? A yes versus a no. And you can clearly see a distinction there, which is then allowing us to sort of get a clue that these are not the same words. By looking at the signal, we are able to say, well, yes and no. look quite different. Moreover, if you look at the horizontal side, where you have no loud and no that's said quietly, look at them. They look similar, even though there's actually in the raw form, they're quite different. That's the beauty of converting an audio signal into the frequency domain and then looking at it visually through a spectrogram. Can we do even better? This is often typical in machine learning, right? You're always iterating on the data and trying to extract more salient features. You're doing feature engineering. The answer is yes, of course. Well, a little bit of machine learning, and then it's simply to try and mimic, how our ear is actually hearing the sound. So our ear does not hear all sounds equally, with the same frequency. They don't respond well, to the higher frequencies. The lower band frequencies are actually much crisper to us, and we can tell apart low frequencies far more easier than higher frequency ranges. And we want to effectively use that kind of thing. And this is what is a process called Mel Filterbanks. So and that's what we're going to use to process the signal further. Mel Filterbanks are basically allowing us to understand how the human perception of the sound is, right? And this is something that was developed a long time back. And we'll be using these Mel Filterbanks to effectively bend the frequencies to extract out, much stronger signal in the spectrogram. So again, in the readings, I'll explain what these MFCCs are and what that we're talking about here. We'll also explain what a spectrogram is. But as you can see, on the left-hand side is the original spectrogram, and on the right-hand side is what's called a MFCC, which has been processed effectively. And you can see clearly that there is a yes and the no, and they look different, right? And by extracting these different frequencies that we are seeing over time, what the model gets, is a chance to look at is how things are changing over time on the x-axis. And that's the sort of pattern that the network is going to try and look for and learn for in identifying the keywords yes and no. So we've brought it into a very useful representation. We can certainly do a bit more of engineering, right? For example, we can clean the signal. Sometimes we want to get rid of the quiet yes and the loud yes, those amplitude differences. So sometimes we can normalize a signal in order to make sure the loudness and the quietness is actually kind of, squelched. So that way we can really focus on normalizing, using a normalized clean signal as an input. And the amplitudes are all the same for all the sentences and the words that are inside of your data set. By doing that, it actually helps your neural network learn more robustly. So in this video, what I want you to take away is that we pre-process signals that are coming out of the sensors. We don't just pick the raw signal and feed it straight into the model. No. Instead, what we do is we pre-process that data. And by pre-processing, we are looking for critical features that we want to extract. So it's easier for our models to be able to pick those features up and learn from those features as we train our network. That's the critical message I'm trying to convey to you here. Moreover, what's interesting is that when you do pre-processing, you're not looking at the signal in the original format. We are actually completely converting it into a different representation, right? We went for an audio time series signal into a frequency signal. And we're looking at that frequency, as a picture. And that's important over here. And that's what makes it efficient for training in our neural network model.